afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting momentarily. Just going to wait a few seconds for folks to file in from the waiting room. So we'll be starting momentarily. Just going to give it a few seconds. We will be starting in just a few moments. Just going to wait for folks to file in from the waiting room. It's always an awkward first 60 seconds or so. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We don't do too many Sunday afternoon programs. Glad you were able to make it. Weather's fairly nice today. I think we're almost going to hit 50 or so, but glad you chose us for the next hour or so. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. I want to thank the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover for partnering with Tewksbury this afternoon. And I also, well, I will just be upfront with you. David is actually donating his time, which is very generous of him. But in general, I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library who sponsor all our programs here at the library for adults, teens, and kids. We're a very active programming library, and it's thanks in large part to the Friends and their generosity. We are in Zoom webinar mode. Which means that David nor I can see you or hear you. I wanted to let you know that we are recording though, but the camera will just be picking up David and his screen. It obviously won't capture any of your faces if you're watching at home. But because we can't hear you or see you, if you have any comments or if you have any questions, you're going to want to type those into the chat box or the Q&A box. And we will address all questions and comments at the end of the presentation. I anticipate David's presentation will last approximately an hour, and then we'll take questions. I want folks to keep an eye out later this afternoon for an email from me. In the email will be a link to a feedback survey. Let us know what you thought of this afternoon's event and what you'd like to see for future events from the Tewksbury Library. And I will also pass along survey results to the North Andover Library. Also in that email will be a link to this recording, and feel free to watch and share with your friends. Watch again and share with your friends. All right, so as an icebreaker, before I introduce David, for those who are comfortable doing so, no obligation, no pressure. But for those who are comfortable doing so, feel free in the chat to let us know where you're joining us from this afternoon. So feel free to type in your hometown, your city, your town, and let us know where you're coming from. That's always fun. Fun little icebreaker. Wonderful. I'm seeing some things pop up. Excellent, excellent, wonderful. Welcome, 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 welcome. Okay, so let's get to the good stuff here. This afternoon's presentation is entitled Racism and Civil Rights, a Historical Perspective. The United States has reached a critical time as civil unrest and mass protests against racist policies become more frequent across the country. The increased discontent and polarization has no clear resolution in sight and continues to challenge and weaken the bonds of our communities. Unfortunately, racism and the struggle for civil rights and equity is not new to the American experience. To help us understand how we arrived at this point, Professor David Kalivas will offer a reflection on the history and racism and the history of racism and civil rights in the United States. David, who holds a PhD, currently serves as Senior Adjunct Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Prior to his retirement, he was a full-time professor at Middlesex Community College, a professor of history, for nearly 40 years. For the last 13 years of his career at the college, he served as founding director of the Commonwealth Honors Program. His teaching and research interests cover a broad range of topics in world history, with specialties in the history of racism, religion, and cross-cultural interactions. As I mentioned, David has a PhD from Northeastern University, a master's from the University of Connecticut, and a bachelor's degree from Suffolk University. So all of us here live on Zoom, let's give David a big virtual round of applause for joining us this afternoon. And David, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Robert. I very much appreciate your introduction. It was very kind and gracious, and for the opportunity to share what I have been learning really for the past 40 plus years with this group of good people that have gathered on a Sunday in Zoom. Very different from, of course, being in a room together where we could see each other and even interact a bit. But this is the world of the pandemic, and I think that it is a great opportunity for us to engage in a very, very timely and serious topic. The topic today: race, racism, civil rights, and historical perspective. This is going to be a presentation with a very broad brushstroke so that we can understand the historical context for the issues that are before us today. And the issues of racism and the issues of civil rights, while we may think of them as something that is relevant to the past, perhaps 50 or 60 years of US history with some connection to the history before, what I will try to do today is offer you a presentation that will inform you that the issue of racism, that the ideas around race, and that the struggle for civil rights, the struggle for human rights, as something that our communities in the United States, the African American communities, our Black American communities have been struggling with since the creation of the colonies in the New World, and have continued to struggle to achieve their full dignity as human beings, and to achieve the full dignity that comes along with recognition that we are all equal and we are all human beings and we all have rights accorded to us by our society, that we are all part of this civil society in the United States and before it in the colonies, where everyone is really was not equal, but everyone had this opportunity before them when either they could pursue their lives and their destinies or they couldn't, because they were in bondage and they were brought over here as slaves from West Africa mostly, and in bondage and as really slavery as something that existed for almost 5 centuries. And there is an implication of what happens when you have a society in a world where slavery was the norm. There is an influence on culture, and that influence continues right to the present day. And I'm going to try and outline what that influence was, and how the struggle for human rights and the struggle for the full civil rights of African Americans is part of the American experience. It has been something that is not an aside. It's something that's not just here, and we look at it as something that happened periodically in US history. It has been part and integrated fully and is part of any understanding of US history and US culture. So we'll try and examine what all of this means in the next 45 to 50 minutes. And so it is going to be this broad brushstroke approach. It is one that's going to ask you to think about civil rights and human rights as something that is a challenge in these times, but has been a challenge for the past several hundred years in the West in particular, but also with regard to the United States, which is our topic today. So I thought I'd start with a quote from James Baldwin. And if you don't know who James Baldwin is, I believe James Baldwin is someone that you need to read. He is often referred to as the soul of the civil rights movement. He is a noted literary figure, and we'll talk a bit more about him later. But in this essay, Unnameable Objects and Unspeakable Crimes, 1965, I took this quote because it seems like a good way to begin. And the quote is that history does not refer merely to the past. History is literally present in all that we do. Think about that for a moment. It's present in all that we do. And the reason I'm doing this broad brushstroke approach to the history of civil rights and racism is that we often don't realize just how ingrained institutional racism is, cultural racism is in US culture. And that's probably because history is not ingrained in the way we educate, in the way we understand the past of the United States. And James Baldwin really asks us to think about the role of history in everything that we do and in our lives. And if we do that, we'll begin to realize that even the history of Black History Month, that Black History Month has its origins in the struggle against segregation. And in this regard, what's really, I'm just going to, talk about this for a moment. In this regard, this fellow, Carter G. Woodson, a PhD from Harvard University, was one of the helped found in 1915, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which is now the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And in 1925, Woodson helped spearhead the movement to create the forerunner of what is the Black History Month in creating the History and Literature and then the Negro Achievement Week. And by 1926, it was the Negro History Week. By the 1960s, late 1960s, well after Woodson died in 1950, by the 1966, then we are seeing the creation of a Black History Month. And by 1976, Gerald Ford was the first president to issue a proclamation, and every president since has issued a proclamation heralding Black History Month. But Woodson, at the outset, didn't want this just to be 1 month a year, or in his case, 1 week a year, where we celebrate the achievements of Black Americans, African Americans. It is to be that, but it's also should be integrated into how we approach the study of history and integrated into US history. And that is something I think that we still struggle with. And even for myself, frankly, how did I come to the study of the history of race, the history of racism, and the history of civil rights? I came to it as early as my undergraduate days in the 70s. And it's something, and I won't spend much time because we don't have, the luxury of 3 hours. We're not calling out for pizza, but, and spending the next several hours here. But when I first started learning about the Civil War, for instance, in high school in the early 70s, it was presented as a conflict that erupted over states' rights. Now, I want you to think about that a moment. It wasn't over states' rights. It was on the surface, perhaps, but it was about slavery and the right to own slaves. Yet it was still being presented as a struggle for states' rights that led to the split. And as I began to study as an undergraduate in the mid-70s, into the late 70s, I began to learn more and more about the history of race and racism. And as I began to learn more, I began to realize what I had learned in high school wasn't quite as all sort of encompassing of understanding the history of race and racism and the history of slavery as it related to the Civil War. In fact, I will argue to you that the history of the Civil War has yet to be fully addressed in our society. We have yet to address it fully on a grand social scale. In quite the way, for instance, that Nazi Germany has, it took a while, but finally the modern Republic of Germany, came to terms and has continued to come to terms from the 60s into the 70s, right into the present, with its Nazi past. And we have yet to come to terms with the Civil War and the embodiment of racism and the embodiment of slavery in that conflict and how it has had an influence all the way to the present. And so we really haven't achieved it yet. And I think that we struggle with that, and we will continue to struggle with it. And that means we need source material. One of the things, I'm obviously a white guy. I have obviously, and I cannot understand the African-American experience because I haven't experienced it. I do not have a lived in reality of what it means to be a Black American. It just, I don't have that experience. I have to use empathy. I have to use my abilities to learn and to understand, to begin to understand what the Black experience, the African-American experience has been in the United States. And that is something that I began learning as an undergraduate. And one of the things that I think is so important is that we need source material, evidence, if you would. We can't just come to opinions, and we just can't come to understanding if we don't have evidence and source material. And so I'm just going to share quickly some of that evidence and source material that can be instructive to begin to understand the African-American experience by listening and reading African-American authors, by engaging with the African-American community and learning. And James Baldwin is someone I recommend to you highly. He wrote a book in 1963 called The Fire Next Time that's in the center here. And The Fire Next Time is a letter to his nephew that essentially talks, and remind you, 1963, this is still a very segregated America. And we have yet to achieve these 1964 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. And so we are still dealing with a very segregated America. The civil rights movement being led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And his associates, starting in the 50s into the 60s, are still struggling. They are still facing a white backlash that was very violent. And when he writes this letter, James Baldwin, in this epistolary form in The Fire Next Time, he's writing to his nephew what it means to be Black in America and what it means to face racism. In 2015, 52 years later, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, another one I highly recommend to you, an African-American author who in 2015 picks up on Baldwin's style, and in the epistolary format, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes Between the World and Me, which is a letter in the form of a letter to his son, essentially recounting the same struggles and the same problems and of what it means to be Black in America. And then Ibram X. Kendi, who's written a book on the bottom here, right, called Stamped from the Beginning, which is a tremendous history. And by the way, Ibram X. Kendi is a professor and runs the Center on Anti-Racism at Boston University now. Ibram X. Kendi wrote this Stamped from the Beginning, a tremendously important contribution to the history of race and racism in the United States. But he also wrote another book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. But in that book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi also uses the epistolary format where he recounts what it was like for him to grow up as an African-American in the United States. So I think, and again, there are more books here. I'll provide Robert with a list of them, but they are important to begin to get a window on the African-American experience personally, and then to begin to read the history, of course. And if I had more time, I would go over all the books, but I urge you to have a look at these books. They are touch upon some central figures and central movements in the African-American experience. And of course, Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents are phenomenal in terms of an understanding of the African-American experience. And she also globalizes it in her book, Caste. And the book on W.E.B. Du Bois by David Levering Lewis, a central figure, W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'll just mention quickly, as we jump to the next slide, is that where do we go from here? Chaos to Community. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote this, and it was published in 1967, shortly before his death. A powerful figure, obviously, and a powerful work on where do we go from here that still has resonance for us today. And if you've never seen The Eyes on the Prize, it's a powerful primary media source This is a video, a picture, but it's also streaming. It is one of the most powerful primary media sources on the civil rights movement you can find. And I urge you to go to the sources on your own and learn more. So where do we begin? You know, we begin with the importance of history, of course. And I'm going to give you one little more analogy, that the study of history is like driving our car. When we drive our cars, we have rear view and side view mirrors. I mean, legally, you have to have them, right? And when you're moving forward, you need to see what's on the side, what's behind, where you've been. Well, if we have to have side view and rear view mirrors on our cars, history is that. It's the side and rear view mirrors. We need to see what brought us here. So where do we begin? Well, we begin with the Atlantic slave trade, which, you could say, oh, the Atlantic slave trade, that was a period way in the past. It was a period of nearly 500 years, 450 years of slavery and 450 years of the slave trade, which really only ended at the beginning to the mid part of the 19th century, 150 plus years ago. So how can something that was only ending roughly 150 plus years ago have no influence on our culture today? I ask you, how can that be? So here we have, just to begin, we've always learned about the age of discovery, haven't we? We've learned about Columbus sailing the ocean blue. 1492, he sailed the ocean blue. What Columbus, of course, and Vasco da Gama and the rest of those Europeans who began expanding, Magellan didn't quite make it, of course, but as they were expanding from Europe beginning in the 15th century, and as the Spanish kingdoms, as the European kingdoms began to set up their colonies, we often refer to them in our educational talk as settlements and as colonies and as discovery. Well, sure, they discovered a new world, but it wasn't all about discovery, was it? It was about conquest. When Columbus puts his flag on the islands, and when the British and the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese put their flags in Central, South, and North America and claim it for their monarchies and their societies, they are conquering it. It's the age of conquest. And initially, they began to establish plantations and mining, of course, operations, depending on where they were. And as they began to do that, they began to enslave indigenous peoples in the Americas. That didn't work out too well for a host of reasons. And then they began in the late 16th century into the 17th century to bring slaves and to engage what we call the Atlantic slave trade with West Africa. And this map shows you the infamous triangle trade system that really went from the 15th right into the 19th century. And what this means is, as the European and then the New World society began to develop and expand between the 16th into the 19th century, and we really did begin to see globalization and global trade with the West and with the Spice Islands and with the Indian Ocean markets and with the East Asian markets, the Chinese markets, later on the Japanese markets, the maritime and mainland Southeast Asian markets. We saw globalization beginning and this global trade. But what we saw was the beginnings of a society and an economic boom that was based on slavery. And in fact, when we look at the transatlantic slave, the Atlantic slave trade, even the language was one of exports and imports. These two slides are charts. Are slides that show you, that lists for you the number of slaves that were exported from West Africa into the New World, or exported. And what you can see, this is around 10 million. Now, this is the language of business, isn't it? Exports. And then they'll talk about imports. We're importing slaves into the Spanish Empire, the British West Indies, all the way down, and it shows numbers. And this excludes those who died in transit from the interior, of course, of the west of the interior areas of West Africa to the coastal forts, the slave forts of West Africa. It excludes those who died en route over the very horrible process of packing human beings who were stolen from their lives and packing them into the ships. These slides right here give you an image that you've probably seen of slave ships and how human beings were packed, lined up, depending on the level, side by side, where they would just, first of all, the horror of being captured, stolen from your lives, being brought together with all kinds of other peoples whose languages were many and varied, and cultures who you didn't even know. You're on there, you're packed into these ships. You are then brought over this awful journey when you're in your own excrement, your own filth, and then you're brought up on deck every so often so they can be cleaned out. And then you're put back down. Forget about seasickness and the horror of it all and the disease that could happen. This is part of a dehumanization process. The Atlantic slave trade embodied a dehumanization process where West African human beings, in all their diversity, with their rich history, were dehumanized in the eyes of their slavers as they were brought over as slaves. And of course, if things didn't go well on the journey, if maybe there was some disease outbreak on board, or perhaps there was a food shortage, or for varieties of reasons, it has been recorded that these human beings who were enslaved were simply thrown overboard, just like cargo. That's the dehumanization process. And so what we see is, over these nearly 5 centuries, that normal business practices emerge around a slave society in a culture that supports it. Branding slaves, not a problem, right? We have the evidence of the branding irons, the evidence of the brutality of the Atlantic slave trade. But this dehumanization process is really complete as slaves are auctioned off in our cities. So let's just take the United States in the 5 decades before the Civil War. If you went to Charleston, if you went to any number of cities in the United States, Baltimore, you would find slave auctions, and where it would be very normal. We're auctioning off human beings. And these aren't like us, white society, these are them. So this dehumanization process and justifications that, oh, we're going to give them a better life than they had, begins here. And of course, it filters through newspapers, flyers, bills of auction, everywhere you look. And so and then when slaves ran away, then they would be bounties on the runaway slaves. It really did. And if you think that it only impacted the Southern culture, you're wrong. Slavery and the slave trade enriched New England. The slaving ships themselves were built in Rhode Island and Massachusetts and even Maine. And so this, if you look at the wealth of the New England merchants of this era, they were intricately connected to the slave trade and to the produce, the production of that slave trade. When people began producing cotton, and of course, cotton would fuel the industrial mills in the North. And then the cod. I mean, not only that, but we have cod, the fish production of New England. Fish would be sold, salted fish would be sold back to the slave plantations. They'd be sold back also into the Caribbean, into the sugarcane plantations. So slavery and the slave culture permeated the colonies and the United States. So much so that if we look to the founding of the United States, in the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, if we look to Article 1, Section 2, often referred to as the 3/5 clause. And in Article 1, Section 2, and just a little snapshot, we have much to do, I'm just trying to give you a flavor, is it says, any person not free would be counted as 3/5 of a free individual for the purposes of determining congressional representation. This means, of course, from the very beginning, the founders of the United States couldn't resolve the issue of slavery, and in the Constitution, these human beings who were stolen from their lives in West Africa were simply referred to as 3/5 of a person. Now, does this mean that everything was moral when it came to slavery? Yes, it was. It means essentially in the 18th century, by the time we're here, a couple hundred years of the slave trade, what we see is that slavery and the culture that was both supported economically and politically by slavery saw it as very, very normal. Yet in the 18th century, groups of people began to realize, well, it's not moral. And so we see the abolitionist movement beginning in the 18th century, and we see the struggle for human rights, the struggle for civil rights begins really with the abolitionist movement. And eventually, of course, whole segments of society did not think it was normal. Whoops, hold on, I hit a button. Can you still see the slides?
We can still see the slides, David.
Okay, when you hit a button on Zoom. Okay, sorry. Okay. Eventually, it wasn't normal. This is the symbol of the abolitionist movement, and it was actually created and by Josiah Wedgwood of the famous Wedgwood pottery, the potter in England. And it says here, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And of course, we could simply say, "Am I not a person?" And but this was the symbol, right? And so the abolitionist movement begins, and as it begins in the 18th century, clearly it is not. Okay, I'm having trouble. Here we go. It is not something that is seen normal by all. And some of our earliest abolitionists, of course, are also freed slaves, people who escaped slavery. And I'm just going to mention Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman as three. And so this is something in the early 19th century, during the era of slavery in the United States, leading up to the Civil War. And if you haven't read about these three figures, you should. This book by David Blight on Frederick Douglass is phenomenal. Frederick Douglass, in so many ways, becomes an icon of the struggle for civil and human rights, escaping from slavery and becoming a pivotal figure in U.S. history in the 19th century, as did Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. Douglass just takes this to another level in terms of his role, and I urge you to learn more. But this means that essentially, the notion that the Southern plantation owners, the notion that those who supported slavery always had, is that the slaves were docile, that the slaves, and we did things that were really good for the slaves. We gave them Christianity. We were giving them a good life. And okay, it wasn't always as good as it could be, but at least eternally, we were bringing them to the Lord. We were bringing them to the true light. And so there was this, I call it odd combination of cultural, moral, religious justification for slavery, and that they didn't rebel when we know there were many, many slave insurrections, and we don't have time to get into them. But there were many slave insurrections because this was a brutal, horrible system where your full dignity as human beings didn't exist, where you were raped, you were molested, you were murdered, you were maimed by your masters for the unlikeliest of offenses, for the unlikeliest of whims. It was a horrible, horrible time. And of course, by the time we get to the Civil War, as this slide shows us, this slide has the Civil War in a romantic, if you would, notion, a horrible notion, the war, the two sides, the Confederate and the Union side charging against one another in battle, and that, it ended, and that there was a reconstruction period, and then we moved forward. But there's a lot of history and memory, and there's a lot of myths and outright lies that occur as we move forward and that create the conditions for segregation and the conditions for virtual re-enslavement in so many instances in the United States. And I want to talk to them now. And so the first is this powerful myth of states' rights. And this is a very powerful myth, that states' rights was the cause for the Civil War, not slavery. I want to take us to the South Carolina's Declaration of Succession. If we look at this Declaration of Succession, and I'm going to quote, and because evidence is so important, because today what we have happening in the United States is a glorification of the Civil War to some degree by certain quarters, and that we have this notion that somehow the Civil War was about states' rights. Segregationists in the 50s and in the 60s in the South made the same argument, by the way. And if we look at South Carolina's Declaration of Succession, and I quote, "Those states assume the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions." By those states, the reference is to the northern states. What's being said here is that the northern states are assuming they have the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions and have denied the rights of property, I've underlined this, established in 15 of the states and recognized by the Constitution of those said states, essentially. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. They have permitted open establishment among them of societies like the Abolitionist Society, whose avowed object is to disturb the peace and to elloign the property, take away the property of the citizens of other states. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes, and those who remain have been incited by emissaries' books, and you get the picture. This is in the Successionist Declaration, that essentially they are saying the reason we are succeeding is because of our rights of property, our rights to hold slaves. That's why they succeeded. That's what the war was about. And if we look in the Constitution of the Confederacy itself, Article 4, Section 2.1, what we see is, here it is, right in the Constitution of the Confederate States of America. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of the Confederacy with their slaves and other property. And the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. And so when we think of the Confederacy and the Civil War, we must always remember it was about slavery, and slavery was rooted in the belief that there were inferior races and superior races, and that slavery and the culture of slavery was rooted in the belief that the white Europeans and by extension, the United States, were at the top of a racial hierarchy. And if we look into the full context of the global history within the 19th century, we'll see that the context of that history is an era of imperialism and a culture, as you can see here, where as the United States in the 19th century was expanding from the eastern seaboard to the western seaboard, and as it was essentially conquering the indigenous peoples of the United States and putting them on the equivalent of open air concentration camps called reservations, and as they were essentially doing this and having a society that was in the throes of a civil war over slavery that was rooted in racism, globally, the Western Europeans were conquering the world too. And they were doing so, you see here Bismarck with other Europeans and the African cake, as it was referred, that they were carving up Africa, of course, into colonial Africa, which meant all essentially with the exception of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, which was conquered by the Italians in 1935. But with the exception of Ethiopia, Africa was carved up into colonies, as was India, as was Southeast Asia, Where did the Vietnam War come from? Of course, it came from the remnants of French colonialism in Southeast Asia. So the culture that is racism, that created racism as normal, wasn't unique to the United States. It was part of the global culture that the West was infusing with its imperialist policies. And those policies, of course, the US was not doing globally, but was doing within the United States. And one of the remnants of that, of course, was this notion that as the Civil War ended, and as we had the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, the Civil War amendments that freed the slaves, that created the rights of due process and citizenship and guaranteed the right to vote, all of which was imposed on the Southern states during the Reconstruction era. It was being done, of course, within this framework of a culture that was globally challenged by in dealing with the impact of imperialism and imperialist foreign policies of conquest rooted in racism. And for a time, federal troops began to give the freed people of the United States, the former slaves, opportunities to begin to hold office, to begin to struggle economically and politically to rise up out of the bondage of slavery for a short time. But this is within the context culturally of a racist world. And all we have to do is look at some of the classic works of the era, from Herbert Spencer's The Evolution of Society, that really influenced the development of what we call social Darwinism, which is, it all helped to lead to this notion of a scientific racism. So by the mid to late 19th century, there is this notion that racism is scientific. Arthur de Gobineau wrote The Inequality of the Human Races. Even Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, which is culturally heralding the superiority of the West. And William Graham Sumner, not to be confused with the abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, wrote about what do the social classes owe each other, and he said virtually nothing. But infused within this was this notion that white society and white Europeans and the ancestors of white Europeans were superior. So when Adolf Hitler comes up on the scene in the 20th century with Mein Kampf, he didn't come out of nowhere. He wasn't an aberration. He comes out of this culture. Oh, always running out of time. Well, here we go. In the late 19th century, during the Reconstruction period, up until the late 1870s, Black office holders, I want to just bring your attention to them. If we go through the states, we can see that African Americans began to hold local and federal offices. We had ambassadors, even 2 senators, members of the House of Representatives. This chart begins to show you that African Americans began to take positions of authority, began the journey out of bondage. Well, after Reconstruction ends, and it ends because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party make a deal to pull federal troops out of the South so that the Republicans can hold on to the presidency. And what begins after Reconstruction in earnest is what is referred to as Jim Crow America, essentially apartheid in the United States, segregation. By the 1890s, most of the African Americans that had either been barred or had been abandoned electoral politics because of what is referred to as extra-legal violence and economic reprisals from southern localities and southern states. And by 1896, there's a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, that essentially established the separate but equal clause. Now, it was separate and wholly unequal, but Plessy versus Ferguson by 1896 takes what had become, in fact, a segregated society, in a society where white, if you would, America and the white segregationists in the South had a resurgence, and they took over. And that, yes, the Civil War ended. Yes, It ended to free the slaves. And by essentially into the 1870s, into the early 1900s, the South was going to reestablish itself, and they did. So lynchings and violence against African Americans became a norm. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and other paramilitary organizations, and I mean, a very famous one, the Red Shirts of Hamburg, South Carolina, where Benjamin Tillman, who would become governor and then a senator, brutalized African Americans. And so they were all forms of extra legal violent means, and this is essentially a lynching. Lynching became the tool to intimidate and to put the African Americans back in their place, and that place was underneath white society. And so this is the least gruesome, but any hanging is gruesome. If you look at pictures from the late 19th century into the early 1900s, you will see pictures where multiple African Americans are being hung, brutalized, mutilated, and some of the pictures will have whole families in the celebratory fashion, essentially celebrating the lynching. And what we should realize is that the history of violence was perpetrated against African Americans and has been perpetrated against African Americans for the past 100+ years. And so these are just two very powerful examples. 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina. A massacre of over 70 African-American citizens in what was a coup d'etat against the city government of Wilmington that included many African-Americans. And that's a picture of the burned buildings and the whites with their rifles. It literally was white society arming and massacring the Black community and pushing out the elected African-Americans in the city government, and nothing happened to them. And then, of course, we're in the centennial of the Greenwood Massacre, referred to as the Tulsa Massacre, massacre of 1921. And you can see whole blocks of a very prosperous African-American community with upper and middle class segments massacred, and has really not fully recovered to this day in many ways. And so what we see from the 19th century as it extends into the 20th century, a segregated America, legally so, where these images show you, for colored only. This one shows you white ladies only. We cater to white trade only in Lancaster, Ohio, a Detroit suburb. We want white tenants in our white community. Even the national park, as it begins to emerge, and picnics and campgrounds. This would be the Negro area. We have here, let's put the next slide. And we have here a bus station in South Carolina, colored waiting room. This became the culture. And these signs, but also as African Americans would travel from state to state, from town to town, they needed to know how to travel. So in the 20th century, and I'm moving along for purposes of time, in the 20th century, we begin to see the need, because of lynchings, because of persecution and violence perpetrated against African Americans if they were in the wrong community at the wrong time. We begin to see, there was a movie on this that wasn't wholly accurate as far as I'm concerned, the Green Book for Negro travel. And the Green Book was something that the African Americans could use as they're traveling in the 30s and then 40s, so you could know which towns to avoid and which towns not to avoid. Because in the United States, mostly in northern, Midwestern, and California, Western areas of the United States, there was something called sundown towns, Massachusetts towns. Groton, for instance, still had it on the books up until recently, I believe. Groton, Mass. Had ordinances that if you were an African American in their town after dark, you were subject to prosecution or worse, harassment, persecution, or even murder. And so this reality of the sundown towns, of course, shows us essentially just the extent of the influence of segregation in the culture and of the sort of role of the KKK. So great was this role that in March 1925, there's the march in Washington, D.C., where essentially several thousand people, many people in government, who are wearing their KKK uniforms without the mask covering them. So bold it was. And let's not forget, Woodrow Wilson himself was one of a leading segregationist, and that's another story. So if we're going to understand the history of civil rights, we need to go back to see where the history of race and racism comes from, the role of slavery, what happens after this, essentially the Civil War, and the struggle against a violent white America, and to the point when lynchings became so, I mean, it's all, just to be lynched is awful. Ida B. Wells did a study, and she was an early civil rights leader and one of the founders of the NAACP. And she essentially did a study of the lynching law in Georgia and was very helpful in documenting the 6,000+ human beings that were brutalized for just being Black. And so the NAACP, of course, founded in 1909, is in a response to the persecution and violence against African Americans. Now, I want to move this along, but remember, when African Americans fought in World War I and World War II, they fought in segregated military units. And it's not until Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954 that Plessy versus Ferguson and legal apartheid, legal segregation in the United States is overturned. And with all deliberate speed, the opinion was with all deliberate speed to integrate schools and to integrate the United States. Well, we think of course, the civil rights movement is starting with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 50s and 60s. But as you can see, the struggle starts way before. But by the time we get to the 60s, of course, we have to ask ourselves a question. Not only what took so long, but by the time we get to the 60s, there is an impatience because this struggle has been going on. The brutality of the segregated United States was so entrenched that this was a breath of hope in 64 and 65. Now, the culture of racism and white supremacy, I'm just going to throw another thing in here and then tie it all up as we hopefully conclude in the next few minutes, that this culture of racism and white supremacy that the Civil Rights Movement fought against, that the Civil Rights Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65 was designed to end, yet it didn't. White supremacy and racism is still in the fabric of our society. We know with, schools integration and busing in Boston in 1976. Of course, this is an iconic image. We don't have time to examine the image completely, but there were mass protests in Boston, New York. We still see today. Yes, it gets into the political arena as well. People are flying Confederate flags and is part of their rights of self-expression, as part of their protest, as part of their claims to represent Southern heritage. This was a shot I took, and I was not driving, but I was in the car this was like maybe 3 years ago. Actually, this is 4 years ago. This is in Lowell, actually. And there was a fellow with the Confederate flag. You can't see it too well. And I thought, this is the North, the Union. We won. And the Confederate flag represents the Confederacy. But I don't think people understand what it really represents, and nor do they understand the Confederate monuments. So we can still see white supremacy in many forms with the use of the Confederate flags, with the use of celebrating, if you would, Confederate monuments. Now, this was the Robert E. Lee statue erected in 1884, came down in 2017 in New Orleans. This is Silent Sam, who eventually, he was erected in 1913 on the campus of the University of North Carolina, and eventually came down. But I have to tell you, the Silent Sam, I'm going to take just a moment. Silent Sam and all the other Confederate monuments. This is Stone Mountain, Georgia, huge Stone Mountain, Georgia. This is one of the largest, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, one of the largest Confederate monuments in Stone Mountain. It's 400 feet above ground. It's 76 feet by 158 feet. And I believe that it's recessed into the mountain 42 feet. It's huge. This, of course, for years was the site of annual Ku Klux Klan cross burnings and celebrations, and is a symbol of racism. Now, what's important to realize here is that, you know, whether it's the Robert E. Lee statue that was erected in 1917, that was also the centerpiece of the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where the civil rights activist was murdered. These are neo-Nazis and white supremacists. And there they are, protesting with the Confederate flags, with the neo-Nazi flag. But what we have to come to terms with is that when we see the Confederate flags, it's the same thing as the Nazi flag. We can't ignore this. And let me show you. Let me just share with you, when these monuments were erected, beginning in the late 1880s and into the 1890s and roughly into the early 1920s, they weren't erected after Reconstruction. They weren't erected after the Civil War. They were erected much later. And Silent Sam at the University of North Carolina campus is instructive of what these monuments, it's not erasing history. Would you want there to be a statue of Hitler? Would you want there to be a statue of Hermann Goering? If you were in Germany, a statue of Heinrich Himmler, a statue of Mengele from the infamous doctor from Auschwitz? No, of course not, because it's clear what they represent: the racism and the hatred of the Nazis. And these flags and these statues represent the racism of the Confederacy. And so much so, all we have to do is realize they were erected to show the resurgence of white society. And I have a speech from Julian Carr. He, a former soldier from the in the Civil War, Confederate soldier, and he was a wealthy businessman in North Carolina. He was invited to the dedication of Silent Sam in 1913. And so bear with me in time. I'm hoping to close out in about 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes. And in this speech, I just want to read you some very short selections. So Julian Carr is at this site that you see, and this is the, Silent Sam. It is a memorial to essentially all the university students who fought and died in the Civil War. Remember, this is 1913. We're still not too far. Julian Carr himself was a young Confederate soldier now as he's older. And here's Julian Carr in his speech to dedicate the Silent Sam Monument. He says, Julian Carr says, "There are no words that I have been able to find in the vocabulary of the English language that fittingly express my feelings in this presence on this occasion. But you should know, and I know, that though I might speak with the tongue of men and of angels, neither song nor story could fittingly honor this glorious event. The whole Southland is sanctified by the precious blood of the young Confederate students who became these soldiers. They fought not for conquest, not for coercion, but from a high and holy sense of duty. This noble gift of the United Daughters of the Confederacy touches deeply and tenderly the heart of every man who has the privilege of claiming the University of North Carolina as his alma mater. This monument was erected, this bronze monument, to honor the valor of all those who fought and died for our sacred cause." Think about that, our sacred cause. They died fighting for the manhood of the South and the highest product which a Christian race has yet to attain. This beautiful memorial is unique in one aspect. I have participated at the unveiling of several Confederate monuments, and have intimate knowledge of a great many more. But this is the first and only one in which the living survivors have been distinctly mentioned and remembered. And in the distinguished presence, I desire to thank that Daughters of the Confederacy in the name of the living Confederate students for their beautiful and timely thoughtfulness. The present generation, I am persuaded, scarcely takes note of what the Confederate soldier meant to the welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race. During the steadfastness saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South. And today, as a consequence, the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon is to be found in the 13 southern states, praise God. I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion, howbeit a rather personal one. It was 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days perhaps after my return from Appomattox. I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village, she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings, where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed this pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison. Again, dear Daughters of the Confederacy, I thank you in the name of the brave, loyal, patriotic, home-loving young student soldiers who went out from this grand old university to battle for our Southern rights and Southern liberties. God bless every one of you and every daughter of the Confederacy in our dear Southland. Now, I took time to quote because this was the spirit within which these monuments were erected. And this is the spirit of the Confederacy, the perpetuation of a notion of white superiority, of the resurgence of essentially the white regimes in the South. And it is essentially, when you see Robert E. Lee, when you see Jefferson Davis and the Confederate flag, they represent the brutality of the Confederacy, not the myth of a lost cause, of a lost culture that the Gone with the Wind novel to some degree helps to sort of perpetuate, that somehow there was something of value to be held by the Confederacy. No, there wasn't. It was a brutal regime of terror against the Black Americans and the African Americans, and it continued during the Jim Crow apartheid period. And so when you see this flag in the capital of the US today, and people not understanding what it represents, the same ideologies of hate that go with the Holocaust and the Nazis, then we have a problem. And the problem is that when we need to understand the civil rights movement against the backdrop of this struggle in the United States, that when we see the civil rights movement, remember, white society did have a backlash in the South. You see, children were bombed and murdered in Southern churches, lynched, and the civil rights protesters, peaceful protesters were murdered. Dogs and fire cannons, hoses unleashed upon them. And so that when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, as you can see here, and his associates, one of whom Rosa Parks in the Montgomery bus boycott, as you see this staged picture with a journalist, of course, Rosa Parks was a member of the civil rights movement. She didn't just get tired one day and want to sit down. It was planned to fight against the segregated America. And when Martin Luther King goes to Washington in 1963, and essentially, this is what we remember, and he has his I Have a Dream speech. In that speech, I'm just going to quote quickly, he says, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. And we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I put people in parentheses to update it. Well, when he says this, if you look a little further, because that's what we always hear, in his speech, he says, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic stance we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But here we are, 100 years later, the Negro, this is 1963, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is saying, but 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. He says, it would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. I underlined this. 1963 is not an end. It is but a beginning. And those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. Here we are in 2013 from Ferguson on with the persecution, with police brutality. And here we are with the Black Lives Matter movement emerging in 2013 to continue this struggle. The Black Lives Matter movement doesn't exclude lives, as many opponents would say, but the message of the Black Lives Matter movement essentially is institutional racism and persecution that occurs at the expense of Blacks must, after 400 years, 155 years since the Civil War, 55 years since civil rights legislation, must finally stop. There is no white who is telling their children that you have to be careful while driving while white. But where driving while Black is a real phenomenon, when Black families and African-American families have to instruct their teenage children on how to behave in white society so that they do not face the problems of police brutality or persecution in some way or another. So what is important for us to realize, the choice is ours. We can understand the past in its full complexity as it creates the present and value human dignity, recognizing injustices, or suffer from our ignorance in favor of slogans. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Wonderful job. You packed a lot of information in 70 minutes. We do have several questions already, and I would encourage folks to get questions into the Q&A if you haven't already. And I'm going to address them as they came in chronologically here. An anonymous attendee asks, somewhere I heard it suggested that racism has only been around for the last 600 years. Was the previous slavery and oppression based on something other than race?
Yeah, yeah. Oh my God, I said yes in Greek, I'm sorry. So yes, the previous, so slavery has been around since the beginnings of civilization in so many ways. And we don't have time to articulate it all. We even think slavery in some form might have begun in the late Neolithic. It's hard to tell, right? We don't have source materials. We know for sure the ancient Greeks had slavery, the ancient Romans had slavery, no question about it. Yet slavery was not based on notions of biological inferiority. It was not based on ideas that some of us were biologically inferior and superior. It was based on, if you lost a war, you were enslaved. It was based on, if you lost the war, you were enslaved. If you went into debt, you could be sold into slavery. You could find yourself into slavery. It was a slavery that, again, was based on cultural chauvinism, perhaps, based on ethnocentricities. The ancient Greeks and Romans had their ethnocentricities, no question. They were culturally chauvinistic in many, many ways, but you could also find your way out of slavery. You could buy your way out of slavery. You could be freed by your master when you died. There was no, and many of the children were tutored by slaves. Slavery in the ancient and in antiquity, slavery was not based on a notion of racial thinking. That comes from the dehumanization process and the justification process of justifying slavery with the Atlantic slave trade. We see a distinct shift to a color-based understanding that, now keep in mind, initially, remember, who's enslaving the West Africans? It is a white Christian European society as they came to the New World. And I could go into how they are circumventing the Venetians and the Genoese shipping in the Mediterranean and the Ottomans. We have no time for that. However, it is white Christian Europeans, and by extension, their colonies. And so these are people who are saying, Jesus Christ will be our salvation, right? These are folks who are saying, love thy neighbor. Yet, how do you justify this brutality then? How do you justify? Well, you justify it because you are doing the moral, righteous thing. You are bringing to these heathen savages from that's the perception, right? The white Christian slavers are bringing eternal salvation. And of course, they didn't know what religions, many were Muslims because Islam had expanded, of course, into West Africa. There were many indigenous cultures and religions too, native to the different areas in West Africa. And so initially there's this moral, believe it or not, this moral / religious justification. Well, we're enslaving them. But look, all right, they're doing this, but we're going to give them a Christian life. We'll teach them Christianity. They will have eternal salvation. They will not be damned. And then that transitions into the 19th century, into this notion of scientific racism, that then transitions again into the 20th century with the eugenics movement, with the notion that somehow racial hierarchies, it's a jungle out there. Of course that was what was said, right? Social Darwinism. Of course there are hierarchies of race. Of course some of us are more, and then we have laws to prove it. So racism really takes root in the modern era, yes.
Comment from Diana. This was an excellent summation in a short amount of time. Bravo. This ongoing history must be understood by all Americans to cease white supremacy and racism. Next question comes from another anonymous attendee. Are you familiar with the concept of post-traumatic slave syndrome? Do you believe that it affects persons whose families have a history of slavery?
Honestly, I'm not. I mean, this post-traumatic stress from the conditions of slavery, it wasn't defined as such, of course, back in the 19th century. We don't begin, to begin using the PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, until, the past 30 years. It was called shell shock from the wars in World War I and after. So, but there was clearly post-traumatic stress, being brutalized as a slave, clearly. But no, I'm not familiar with it. I'm going to write it down. I can't find my pen right now, but I'll look into it. But no, I'm not. I don't know everything, and I admit to that. No, I don't know that.
Kathy says, excellent lecture. Thank you. I respect your passion. I imagine that you inspired your students. We need your passion in this world.
Oh,
next question comes from Christopher. Multi-part question. Why do you think we still refight the Civil War? On one side, there are still lost causers, and on the other, there are what I call the statue iconoclasts. Can't we remember our history intellectually without remembering it so emotionally, since none of us were alive then?
Great, comment and question. The best way to answer is on several levels. So this book, David Blight, I also was the one who did the book on Frederick Douglass. Race and Reunion talks all about the lost cause and the notion that somehow the Confederate States is there's something worthy to be resurrected about Southern heritage. And I really urge this book. So I'm not just going to pawn a book off you and not answer your question. But the question is one that's rooted in, if we were in Germany after the war, Germany took a while, right? The 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, people began to ask, their parents, what did you do in World War II? And I'm simplifying it. And eventually, Germany began to come to terms with its Nazi past. I say to you that the fact that so many people think that the Civil War monuments are a part of our history, when they are essentially a part of a resurgence of white supremacy and segregationism in the United States, and that the Daughters of the Confederacy are all about essentially corrupting. And yes, that's what I'm going to say. It's about corrupting our past and reinventing a Southern heritage. Look, I'm all for grits. I love it. We've been to Savannah. I've been to Charleston. I have, what is it? Shrimp and grits. Great dish. Love it. Okay. Collard greens and all of the rest, right? If you want that for Southern heritage, great. Southern heritage, though, is not these monuments. These monuments were erected directly to put it in the faces of the African Americans, and the schools that have been named after Southern generals, Confederate generals. If I'm going to just say it again, can you imagine a statue to Hitler, Hermann Goering, Adolf Eichmann? No, horrible. The Confederate flag is the same thing. It represents the racism and the brutality against human beings that the Nazi flag represents. And until we come to terms with that, people are going to think it's Southern pie, and it's the heritage of the U.S. The heritage of the U.S. When I saw that gentleman, I shouldn't call him a gentleman. He wasn't a gentleman. When I saw that insurrectionist in the Capitol building with the Confederate flag that had never been there, and I see it on trucks up here, whether it's in Tewksbury, whether it's in Lowell, whether it's in Bedford, and people flying the Confederate flag, they're flying the Nazi flag. We have failed in our education to present the history of race and racism. We have failed to essentially realize that the history of African Americans is not something only for Black History Month. It must be integrated because it is the defining history of America. The Black experience is the defining part of what America is. And for all too often, we haven't engaged it. And we certainly haven't engaged the history of race and racism that is intricately woven into the fabric of our culture. So much so that we're afraid, I think. We're fearful to understand it for what it might do to our mythology. I don't know if that answers the question, but we need to deal with this history because it is our history, and we don't.
And since Christopher can't talk back to you, he did previously leave some comments. He says, the historian in me completely disagrees with equating the Confederacy with the Third Reich. The latter is in a class by itself. And then he also, previous to that comment, wrote, to be fair, it seems only within the last few years that all CSA references have been seen as inherently problematic. In the right context, they can help understand history.
So in the right context, they can help understand history. And that context is its racist context. It's context of essentially that once the slave trade was outlawed, there was the internal slave trade. The context that masters had the right of life and limb and brutalization of their slaves. And so I think that, yes, I agree. It wasn't the Third Reich, no question. Yet, the ideology of racism that fueled Nazism is the same ideology that fueled the Confederacy and the secession. And if you look at the secession articles and the Constitution of the Confederacy, it was all about maintaining slavery. And to maintain slavery, you have to maintain a racist culture. And so while I agree, it's not the same, and I didn't mean for it to be the same, yet the foundational ideologies are the same. And the results in terms of enslavement and brutalization are the same. Remember, had the Nazis won the war, their plan for the economy was concentration camps and slave labor camps. And so I will differ in that sense. There is too much similarity, and that we must begin to understand the history of the Confederacy and its ideology, and the history of violence and persecution that has resulted with the resurgence after Reconstruction of the segregationists in the South. So it's a complex history. I ask you to go to the source materials, let's read them, and then let's come back and have a discussion.
Next question comes from Don. Don says, how different do you think civil rights would be if Abraham Lincoln had lived through his second term?
Well, I love to have the crystal ball, and I love it myself when I'm, thinking about things. I'm saying, oh, what if this? What would have happened if this had happened? I have no idea, obviously. But what we have to understand about Abraham Lincoln, while heralded, as a hero, and he did issue the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Remember, if we begin to study, Abraham Lincoln himself had a journey to undertake morally, culturally, intellectually. Remember, Abraham Lincoln early on was trying to figure out how we could get all of the African Americans to migrate out of the United States. So there was this early movement to try and figure out, how do we get the blacks all out of here? All right, we're going to do the Civil War, but after the Civil War, how do we, time for them to go back to Africa? And of course, by that point, African Americans were here for several generations. They were not from Africa any longer. They were here, right? And so, but this is Lincoln's journey. So Lincoln shared in the racist culture. He did not believe early on, what would have happened later is he maybe changed, but he did not believe in the equality completely, frankly. And when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, he's only freeing slaves in the rebellious states, not in the border states that had come over to the Union, not in the North, only in the Southern states. So, it's hard to tell. I mean, I think he would have been obviously worlds better than Johnson, who succeeded him. But then Grant does take over. And Grant gets a bum rap in many ways, but Grant does a lot of positive things for Reconstruction. It's what happens when the Democrats and Republicans make a deal in the election of 1877, however, that ends Reconstruction. So I think that, yes, we could have maybe Lincoln, but Grant did pick up the mantle. And Reconstruction was very successful with federal troops with limitations, but they still had to deal with racism in the culture. And frankly, we have yet to fully deal with it. We're only beginning to deal with it, I think. So that's a great question, but we have to learn more about Lincoln. And I think Frederick Douglass, the biography by David Blight, goes wonders, as does Ibram X. Kendi, somewhere here on my shelf. Ibram X. Kendi's book does a great job on a Stand from the Beginning, the definitive history of racist ideas in America, of understanding Lincoln, essentially, among other things. Are there other questions?
There are, and I put information in the chat. Ibram Kendi is speaking at the Lawrence Public Library this Wednesday, March 3rd at 7 o'clock.
Oh.
So I can send you the link, Professor. But
thank you.
You might want to check that out.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Monique, so just to set expectations, Professor, we have 3 more questions to go and we have 6 minutes. Okay.
I can stay as long as there are questions.
Okay.
I mean, as long as you want to stay.
Yeah, we'll go. Let's aim for 3:30. If we go a little longer, it's not the end of the world, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time.
Sure.
Monique says, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Well done. So next question comes from Kara, very specific question. She grew up in Groton, as did her father. Any idea when the Sundown Ordinance was lifted or the years that it was on the books?
So that's a great question. And it's one that I just began learning more about sundown towns myself recently over the past year. And I keep meaning to go and check and I don't know. Someone said to me, it was still on the books recently. And so that is something I'm going to look into. I honestly, I keep forgetting to look into it. But yeah, that's a great question because I'm curious. Sometimes these old ordinances are still on the books. But I think I remember reading somewhere that it was lifted, removed. But again, I'm going to look into that finally. No one's asked me the question and I keep thinking it myself. I got to check. I mentioned Groton. But it's not the only one. There are others. It's just, you would never think it. That's all. And but yeah, I'm going to check.
Sophia says, thank you so much. This was great. Next question. I'm going to skip a question, but I promise to get back to it. Next question goes to Francis. Do the other areas of the Americas that had slavery, like Brazil or the Caribbean, have the same continuing problems with racism like we have here in the United States?
So that's a great question. And I think it's different. I think that they do have issues with racism. I think it also integrates the indigenous populations that are much more numerous as well. Oftentimes, the indigenous populations in Central and South America are at the bottom of the so-called racial hierarchy. And in some societies, there's much more integration, but it really depends on where you are. I hesitate to do this broad brushstroke because of the diversity of the islands, the Caribbean islands, and of Central and South America. Some much more so than others. But in the U.S., because of our legacy with slavery and the Civil War and apartheid or segregation, that we've never come to terms with. Yeah, I think it's much more in your face, if you would. And as we can see, with protesters still carrying the Confederate flags. So case by case, much more in Central and South America.
And let me see. So we had some previous comments from Christopher, but he was essentially agreeing with what you said. So I'm going to skip those in the interest of time. Frances says, thank you, Professor. And our final question from an anonymous attendee. It's a little bit of a loaded one. What do you think the quote, "Make America Great" unquote means? Do you think it's about white supremacy?
I think it's rooted and grounded in white supremacy. There's a simple answer. We could do a more complicated one, but "Make America Great," mind you, has tapped into the white supremacist elements as part of the foundational supporters. And "Make America Great" reminded me when I first heard it of Deutschland über alles. And Deutschland über alles, of course, the Nazis in the 20s and 30s, Germany overall. And of course, becoming the slogan of the Nazis. And "Make America Great" reminded me of speeches of Adolf Hitler, essentially saying that, you know, we must make Germany great again, and we must focus only on Germany, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, there was a parallel, and it certainly tapped into that element that "Make America Great Again" in terms of many of the supporters. But again, that's not a historical thing. That's just me looking at it from the surface and from the people who have, you know, really heralded that "Make America Great Again." Have been a lot of the, you know, whether it's QAnon, whether it's other movements that are just obviously in fantasy land and making things up. I mean, I'll tell you one thing: QAnon was using the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a fabrication from the Russian secret police from the imperial czarist period in the late 19th, early 20th century to justify Russian imperial czarist pogroms against Jews in Russia. And that was one of the documents that QAnon was using to justify its positions, which is really outlandish. So we have to start to look at evidence and what's real evidence. And so historically, any movement that is grounded and supported by white supremacist elements needs to stop and take a look at itself. And I don't believe that it's done that.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor. Kara says, thank you for this webinar. I'm glad I attended. And Francis pointed out in the chat that the Ibram Kendi lecture on Wednesday starts at 6, not 7. So I misspoke about that. And Christopher put some information in the chat about the ordinance from Groton.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So, Professor, any last words before we wrap up?
So, honestly, even I get tired. But so I did attempt to, you know, create this sort of whole package here. And, you know, this is something that I actually used to do in several weeks in class. So I realized I was condensing a lot, but I want to leave us all with this notion, this idea that we need to understand the Black Lives Matter movement in the context of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963 saying, look, we can only put up with this for so long, and then it's going to blow up. And it's blowing up, folks. And it's time to look at institutional racism. It's time to understand racism within the full spectrum of US culture, within its history. and begin to resolve it, or otherwise it's going to continue to blow up. And it's time that we have the full dignity of who we are as human beings across the board, but we can't do that while African Americans suffer the persecution of institutional racism. And so I say it's time to begin to understand our past to move forward. It's sort of like those rear view mirrors. So, and I wish you all the best. Thank you for listening to me. And I really do wish everyone the best as we move forward.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor. Everyone check your email a little bit later on, feedback survey, link to the recording. I'll also provide the Ibram Kendi information as well. Yeah, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon. Those that are watching live, enjoy the goodish weather we have. And thanks again, Professor. I'm going to end the call in about 10 seconds. Thank you all. Everyone have a great day.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'll follow up via email. Great job.
All right, thank you.
Okay.